Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker, Susan Bassnett, is Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Glasgow and Emerita Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Warwick, where she founded the Centre for Translation and Comparative Critical Studies in the 1980s and served twice as Pro-Vice Chancellor. Susan was educated in several European countries, began her academic career in Italy, and has lectured since then in universities around the world. She's the author of over 20 books. Her translation studies, which first appeared in 1980, has remained in print ever since and has become a vital international textbook in the field. Her comparative literature, 1993, has also become internationally renowned and been translated into several languages. Her publications have played a vital role in the establishment of translation studies and comparative literature in the UK and worldwide. Constructing Culture, Essays on Literary Translation with André Lefebvre, 1998. Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice, co-edited with Harish Trivedi, 1999. The Translator as Writer, co-edited with Peter Bush, 2006. Translation in Global News with Esperanza Bielsa, 2009. Reflections on Translation, 2011. And the new critical idiom volume, Translation, 2014. Her most recent publication is the edited volume Translation and World Literature, which came out in 2019 in the Routledge series that Michael Cronin oversees with Moira Ingileri, New Perspectives in Translation and Interpreting Studies. Susan is an elected fellow of the Institute of Linguists, elected fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and a fellow of the Academia Europaea. She was elected president of the British Comparative Literature Association in 2016. Susan's title today is simply The Importance of Translation. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to all. I feel somewhat fraudulent this afternoon because after that very flattering introduction, I'm not going to give a scholarly paper. I unfortunately couldn't be here yesterday. It was our annual postgraduate conference in Glasgow, but we've heard two splendid papers already this afternoon, very scholarly, and I fear I'm going to lower the tone. Because what I'm going to talk about is something very general. And for the benefit of everyone here, when Duncan asked me for a title, or rather said, we have to have a title. I'm so bad at titles, I couldn't think of anything. So I said, oh, the importance of translation. But we all know that translation's important. Translation is important. And so I'm not really going to discuss the importance of translation because I'm taking it for granted. What I am going to talk about, though, I suppose, in a rather random way, is what has been interesting me more and more in the last few years, and that is the idea of randomness. I'm particularly interested in the randomness of textual transfer, how ideas move, how sometimes through translation, but not always through translation, how unexpected patterns of movement occur. And listening this afternoon to Charles, I thought, goodness, Charles and I appear to have been reading the same things during this lockdown. Because like him, I turned to Xavier Demaitre and thought about what does it feel like to be in one's room. I also reread a book from my school days, Silvio Pellico's Le mie prigioni, which was an account of his experiences in a prison in the 19th century. We read randomly, I think. Those of us engaged in writing a specific book or working on a PhD thesis might have a more targeted reading. But on the whole, there is a randomness in what we read. I read very randomly because not only have I inherited a very large collection of books, some of which you can see behind me, from a great aunt who was an English teacher, But I have 4 children, 2 grandchildren, one of whom is now doing French and English for A-level, and they recommend things, and I go off in different directions. And the lockdown period, the last year, has been a good opportunity to explore some of these random ideas. Now, one of the things I've always admired about Michael Cronin is that he too is a random reader. We have many times over the years met one another and with astonishment recognized that we had both been reading the same text or thinking along the same lines. And I value that. I think it shows that even perhaps within randomness, there are ideas that are circulating that one can tap into. And in March 2017, Michael's eco-translation was launched in Dublin. And I was very privileged to be invited to present the book to a very enthusiastic audience. I was particularly happy to do this. I mean, apart from the fact that who wouldn't want a trip to Dublin at any time of the year? It's always been one of my favorite cities. But I have a very high regard for Michael Cronin. I first came across his work many years ago when I was asked to review a manuscript for Cork University Press. That was, I consult my notes, 1996. And I felt then, as I've said on many occasions since, that here was a very original, genuinely original voice. Someone who really does have something to say about translation and culture, and continues to have new ideas, ideas that inspire others. A constant aspect of his thinking, though, is that translation is important. Translation needs to be recognized as of central importance in communication of the present, the past, and the future. Now, in eco-translation, he makes a strong case for the global significance of a notion of translation that takes into account, I quote, the social, cultural, political, and economic factors affecting the interaction of humans with other humans, other organisms, and the physical environment. He argues that we've been living in a time when ends have predominated over means, and he suggests that the key issues for the 21st century, which will need to be addressed by everyone, regardless of their subject affiliation, include, here's his list, food security, climate justice, biodiversity loss, water depletion, energy security, linguicide, the elimination of smaller languages by the more powerful ones, eco-migration, resource conflicts, global monocultures, etc. Translation studies, as a field that looks at how languages move around the world, cannot but engage with what he argues is a shift taking place across the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And we've just heard Rinden's paper, which again is building bridges across disciplines in new and exciting ways. Now, in the chapter in eco-translation entitled The Great Transition, Michael looks at some of the vast planetary changes in communication of the last few years, and he comments pointedly, and I love this quote, "The digital may deliver information to the other side of the planet in seconds, but if the language is different, the virtual letters are dead letters. In a multilingual world, translation is the necessary companion of the global outreach of the virtual." But he also stresses the need for translation not to contribute to what he calls the McDonaldization of the world. And he makes a strong case for place sensitivity. The example that I've used often with my students is the example of the 2010 Haiti earthquake, where the search and rescue exercise was a telling one because one of the biggest problems was language. And the solution, as Michael tells us, was to set up a collaborative translation network where messages posted on a site could actually be read by Haitian Creole speakers around the world. It was, as he puts it, the globally collaborative nature of the translation that saved lives. A collaboration that was to do with understanding the diversification of language. Now, since eco-translation came out 4 years ago, we have all witnessed unprecedented changes in our lives. Just over a year ago, when the pandemic caused by the COVID-19 virus began to spread across the world, millions of people, those who survived, have found themselves confined in their own homes. In some cases, unable to go outside for weeks. In some cases, in some cultures, under curfew. In many cases, forbidden to meet members of their own families for months on end, forbidden to attend funerals, forbidden to engage in all those ritual aspects of life that we all find so sustaining. And that mass global confinement of peoples in various parts in the world and to varying degrees, which is still continuing, has come about through circumstances that appear to be beyond anyone's control. Suddenly unable to move freely in a world where international mobility has come to be so highly prized, confinement was forced upon millions of people without prior warning, and they've had to adjust to immense and, for many, disturbing changes of circumstances. And today, we have no clear idea of how long this pandemic is going to last. The situation in India is absolutely tragic. Here in Britain, we are told that there will be a loosening, a lightening of the various constraints under which we've lived from next Monday, and again, possibly later. We still don't know. I still don't know when I can get back to see my friends in Italy. A friend in Scandinavia rang me yesterday and she said, I want to come and see you, but I can't understand from the website what the situation is with regard to travel from Sweden. These are just silly, rather trivial examples, but the point is that we are living in a completely different set of circumstances. The figures of people who've contracted the disease and the way in which countries have handled the pandemic have been wildly divergent. Some closed their borders, kept the number of hospitalizations and deaths down. This, of course, has been impossible in Europe, where borders are porous. And one of the things we've seen that I think has been extremely concerning, very damaging, is the speed with which the way in which different states have reacted to the pandemic has politicized. The actual medical crisis has become politicized. Some heads of state have underestimated the severity of the pandemic, made dismissive public statements. In some countries, the provision of clothing for medical staff, hospital availability, the provision of vaccines has been hopelessly bad. In others, there's a strong resistance to any kind of vaccination program. And if you look on the internet, you find that conspiracy theories proliferate. All kinds of extraordinary conspiracy theories are out there. At the moment, you go online and start to even think about, well, I won't go there actually, because if I go down the conspiracy theory thing, I could be talking forever. There have been other pandemics. Of course there have. There have been pandemics on a very large scale. I think it's the global scale of this one, though, that makes it different. At the end of the First World War, there were some 500 million people, that's probably a conservative estimate, affected by the Spanish flu. Deaths are estimated at being well over 50 million. In some cases, that figure is given as 80, in some cases 100 million. And the disease adversely attacked younger people, with the majority of the fatalities aged between 20 and 40. The SARS epidemic of 2009 was experienced mainly in Asia. The Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 16 experienced mainly in Africa. But what makes this one different is that what to date has been seen as a sign of 21st century progress, that is the ease of international mobility, has been brought to a sudden dramatic halt. It's also the case that certainly in Europe, the majority of fatalities have been in the older age bracket. And this is another challenge to deal with, given that another sign of progress in the developed world has been the expansion of lifespan. Now, if I think about what's been happening since the early 1990s, the end of the Cold War, the abolition of apartheid, China opening up to the rest of the world, we see that millions of people who previously had been unable to travel now were able to acquire passports and move. And this, combined with changing economic circumstances, that is the emergence of a middle class and a moneyed middle class in many parts of the world, particularly in China and former Soviet-controlled countries, has meant that international travel became a new reality for millions of people. The mass global tourism boom that we've come to take for granted is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's a phenomenon really only of the last 25 to 30 years. The gigantic cruise ships that many of us have seen in Europe in some of our major cities, such as Venice or in Malta or in Copenhagen, those great skyscraper palaces, they have become, you look at the advertising on television across the world, this has become something that millions of people now aspire to. Millions who previously had only dreamt of such adventures. But in 2020, all that came to an abrupt end. And the millions of the newly enfranchised, newly traveling middle class, often the older middle class, were no longer able to be realized. Now, the ending of this kind of mass tourism in 2020 was inevitably combined with many countries closing their borders. And one of the other aspirations of the last 25 to 30 years, which we have seen especially in Europe, has been freedom of movement across national frontiers, something else that has, certainly for the moment, come to a halt. In Europe, the Schengen Agreement, that was implemented in 1995, had guaranteed passport-free travel between those states signed up to it. Not, I may say, neither Britain or Ireland, but certainly passport-free travel was seen as a huge step forward. And yet we've seen that the response of many of the Schengen countries during the pandemic has been to close borders and to start talking about whether or not Schengen is viable in the future. And this bothers me because the very terminology of borders, which is something that in translation studies we've been seeking to go beyond for so long, both in terms of trying to get away from binary divisions between one side and the other side, and in broader, both intellectual and social terms, to move beyond hard borders. The discourse of borders seems to me to be returning. Now, I said this was going to be a very random wander around as I have reflected on what has been going on, as I've reflected in my room full of books. The only solution available to us, with international travel banned and of course libraries closed, museums closed, theatres closed, all those places where we could meet and exchange our thoughts, has been communication like this, Zoom. There's a global boom at the moment in electronic communication. the verb to Zoom has entered into the English language. And yet communicating by Zoom raises all sorts of questions that I think we're going to have to think much harder about as we move into the post-pandemic world. And earlier this year, about 3 months ago, Michael Cronin and I were part of another webinar, and we did share our thoughts on this. And one of the things that Michael pointed out at that stage was the enormous difficulty of telling jokes on Zoom. What does Zoom do to humor? What does electronic communication do to Zoomer? What does it do to humor? And I think, yesterday was a very good example. We had our postgraduate conference. Normally this involves about 40 to 50 people. It is held in Glasgow. Yesterday we had over 100 joining us from all parts of the world, but there was none of the informality, none of the exchanges, the casual exchanges. And those casual exchanges in conferences for postgraduates are often the most valuable part of any conference or any seminar. You meet people informally. You get a chance to exchange names and addresses informally. There are different kinds of contact than doing it via Zoom. Anecdotally, all sorts of things come back to me about Zoom. People report, all my students have reported Zoom being extremely tiring. Working electronically is tiring. Staring at a screen causes various difficulties that had not been presupposed. The degree of concentration required in Zoom is quite different. It's quite different. At this moment, I am speaking to a blank screen, and I have images of Duncan, his photograph is of him smiling, and Rindon, who appears to be at the seaside, and Carolyn, who is also smiling. But I have no idea whether all these smiling faces are smiling at anything I'm saying. I doubt that they are, because of course they're just fixed photographs. Everybody else, oh, now Duncan is smiling. Oh, thank goodness. Thank you, Duncan. But everybody else is just a blank space. And the other day earlier this week, I gave a lecture to what turned out to be over 600 people. And I did not have a single solitary image of any of them. And yet, as every teacher knows, the energy that comes from an audience, the dynamic of being in the same physical space with someone when you're trying to put ideas across is absolutely vital. Oh, someone else has said, oh, that's very kind. I like the idea of people telling me they're smiling. Good, good. Now, obviously, when we move to something like Zoom, somebody is certainly going to be writing a PhD thesis at this very moment on the behavioral changes. How do we interrupt on Zoom? How do we deal with those awkward silences? Why is turn taking so different with electronic communication? All sorts of very curious behavioral phenomena here. And I was reminded, I thought, yeah, what happened in German with the advent of the telephone, where we moved from Auf Wiedersehen to Auf Wiederhören. And I thought that's an example of a technological shift that actually changes the language. How is Zoom going to change our language? What's going to happen? I'm so pleased. Thank you so much, all these people who are telling me you're smiling. It's so nice. At least it's a reaction. Thank you, rather than staring into the blackness. We might remember, of course, when email started, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about communication, how you actually deal with email. I regularly get things that say hi. Sometimes I get dear Professor Bassnett, dear Susan, but I get hi, hello, or an email starts with nothing. There's all sorts of there are ways in which the letter format change. So the technology changes also how we communicate. And so it's probably inevitable that as part of my rereading, I wandered along the shelves and I plucked off the shelves some of my collection of books by Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan, just to remind you, was the Canadian philosopher and communication theorist, author of the Gutenberg Galaxy, who famously distinguished between hot and cool media. Hot media, in his definition, was radio, photography, and cinema, which he defined as being more full of information and therefore allowing less involvement of the user, while cool media, remember he's writing back in the 1960s, telephone and television allowed greater participation by the user. McLuhan died in 1980, but I think many of his ideas were prescient. Because one of the things he was saying was a new medium can reshape our world. It can reshape how we think. He starts out, of course, with how printing reshaped the world. But he argues, yeah, the advent of printing altered consciousness in the Western world. And so electronic media would bring about what he called the global village. But he also warned about technological change. I quote, "Any new technique or new idea or tool, while enabling a new range of activities by the user, pushes aside the older ways of doing things. Money speeds transactions and gives rise to uniform pricing systems, obsolescing haggle and barter and much of the human relation to commodities. The motor car enhanced private mobility and pushed aside the old organization of the city in favor of the suburbs. Some forms are so evanescent that they have their own built-in obsolescence. Nothing is as stale as yesterday's newspaper until it can be retrieved as valuable documentary evidence." Now, of course, he died before the internet began to develop globally, and his distinction between hot and cool media seems, as it does, to belong to another era. But I've been wondering, how might McLuhan label Zoom? Can you really call it? I think it couldn't really be labeled hot or cool. I think it's a kind of hybrid with elements of both. But I still think, though, that his insistence on the fact that technologies change the world, shape our world, reshape is the word I want, reshape the world, remains valid. I see one or two of you are putting on things in defense of Zoom. I cannot praise Zoom highly enough. I have been in regular contact with my family. We have had Zoom calls, we have Zoom recipe sessions, we have, there is, I gather, for the younger members of the family, a Zoom Mario Kart competition that goes on. It's been enormously important. But the point I'm making is not to decry Zoom, but just to say yes, Silke, Zoom could be a lukewarm medium. I don't know how to describe it, but I am saying that it is that we behave differently when we use these forms of communication. I think McLuhan's point about the impact on who we are and how we think made by technological changes is something that needs to be borne in mind. I think also his point about the rapid cycles of obsolescence is another important point. And then, very controversial idea, he also talks about retribalization, the emergence, again, of tribes. As he says this, the global village of corporate consumer values stimulates local people to retrieve who they used to be as a protection for their fading identities. For electronic processes make us all nobodies desperate for identity. And the quest for identity, McLuhan warns, can produce violence. And we might think about the redrawing of borders, the re-erection of borders, the bringing back up of walls, the rise of nationalist thinking in many quarters, the kind of divisions, the old enmities that have come back to the fore during this pandemic. And I think you might say, all right, Susan Bassnett is now giving a kind of apocalyptic vision of the world, and I don't mean to, but I do think that one of the things that has been happening is there is a massive increase of violence on social media. I'm not just talking about the violence of nationalism and nationalist conflicts and people building walls again and borders and so on. I'm also thinking about the violent, aggressive attacks that can take place with anonymity online, on social media. Trolls can attack without any fear of repercussion. And people who have been trolled, some friends of mine who are sort of prominent media figures have had the most appalling trolling that they feel has actually accelerated over the last 12 months. Now, last year, De Gruyter brought out a pamphlet entitled 13 Perspectives on the Pandemic, Thinking in a State of Exception. I would recommend this to anyone. You can easily find it online. Very, very useful piece. And the German political scientist Mark Grimm drew attention to the rise of anti-Semitism during the pandemic. He noted, as I've just done, the rise of conspiracy thinking and made a connection. And I'm just going to quote what Mark says, because I think it makes connections, and that, after all, in translation studies and comparative literary studies, that's what we're all doing. We're making connections. Everywhere we find this kind of alternative knowledge. By alternative knowledge, he means conspiracy theories. I have a next door neighbor, for example, who is obsessed that 5G is going to cause immense damage to all of us here in our village. So everywhere we find this kind of alternative knowledge. With anti-Semitism, just a small number of clicks away. The number of people who, sometimes unwillingly, fabricate their own partisan information through social media is growing. Those people are now starting to follow prominent conspiracy theories on social media and will continue to get their information through these channels in post-coronavirus times. And as the channels grow, the algorithms of social media providers will suggest them to a wider audience. Now, I think he's touched on something intangible and yet really important here, because clearly, as I was saying, if people are unable to engage in everyday conversational exchanges with others during periods of lockdown, all sorts of things happen in isolation. Isolation can lead to disproportionate fears that can be very quickly translated into feelings of paranoia or aggression. I'm struck, and some of you may have more evidence of this, by what I feel is very heightened emotive language online, an emotive language in the media. And one of the examples that I was using with my students is the way in which the poor Queen of England is constantly described as furious, outraged, devastated. And this is an elderly woman whose whole life has been lived, as my late mother's was, according to a refusal to show emotion in public, and whose successful public image rests on her sense of stoicism. All the teachers in my family are reporting a massive increase of violence in their pupils at schools as the schools have reopened. And one of my daughters said, it's as though the kids are having to learn again how to interact socially with one another. Now, translation studies is a field that has sought to break down divisions, to cross over between languages and cultures, to highlight the importance of movement across and between. And so how, one wonders, will translation studies reposition itself in a post-pandemic world where borders of all kinds have been constructed between geographical regions, states, nationalities, races, genders, ages, classes? where binary distinctions are back on the agenda. In eco-translation, Michael Cronin acknowledges the problem of what he calls the ontological fixation, which sees language practice as being about one language or another. A political ecology of translation, says Cronin, views languages as their interconnectedness, not in their isolation, and supporting what he terms an ecological champion of language diversity that eschews binary opposition. He says, I quote, "Notions of translanguaging or metrolingualism are in a sense an attempt to capture that transitional nature of the the silent transformation which characterizes translation in the movement between and through language and context." Now, to what extent will progress to greater connectedness that Michael talks about be set back now with the emergence of the new physical and psychological borders that reinforce or augment the pre-existing borders of the pre-pandemic world? I think that's the question we need to ask. I am told that this period has seen a huge rise in machine translation. And given that this is a cheaper practice, one wonders whether this tendency is likely to continue into the future and what effect this will have on the employment possibilities of translators. Back in 2019, the US economist Richard Baldwin published a controversial book, The Globotics Upheaval, in which he offered a dystopian vision of a future in which face-to-face contact was radically diminished. We might want to think about this when we think about our teaching in the future and when we think also about the role of translators and interpreters. I referred a few minutes ago to the De Gruyter pamphlet. Another contributor to that pamphlet is the translation and cultural studies scholar Doris Bachmann-Medic. Doris sees the pandemic as having narrowed the range of topics featuring in public discourse. And she's also concerned that the complexity of discussions is being reduced. I'm a good example of this. I have greatly reduced the complexity of the discussions of the two previous papers by this very personal approach. Doris Bachmann-Medic is fearful that this narrowing might further reduce funding opportunities in the humanities, as attention will shift to highlighting the importance of research in other areas, vitally important areas. She lists virology, medicine, biotechnology, epidemiology. The global research environment has contracted during the pandemic. And so what Bachmann-Medic is worried about is whether or not humanities, which feel the humanities question and challenge received wisdom, will the humanities be the biggest losers? Now, I'm sure many of you taking part in this discussion today will have added your name to the thousands of colleagues who have signed a petition to protest at the decision of the University of Aston to close its Department of History, Languages and Translation. And that such an action can be proposed now, at this moment, in the midst of this pandemic, appears to reinforce Bachmann-Medic's gloomy thoughts about the future. We might want to ask whether, certainly within the British and American context, has the pandemic served to increase the global hegemony of English? This is something, of course, that Michael has so often written about, the problems of the global hegemony of English and the impact on other languages. How, in Britain, Do we persuade a younger generation of the importance of studying languages, of the value of learning other languages, if that global English hegemony continues to grow? But I like the fact that Doris continues, nevertheless, to insist that one of the important things that the humanities has to contribute is, in fact, its ability and its willingness to challenge shifts in power relations, to the kind of things she cites are changes to the regulation of public and private spaces, the way in which different cultures have perceived and dealt with issues of migration. Though it is the case, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, that the big discussions about climate change and migration have appeared to be given less prominence during the period of the pandemic. And one can only hope that those discussions will actually return to the top of the agenda. Bachmann-Medic insists that the humanities need to hold on to their critical perspective, even if research funding is reduced in a post-pandemic world. And I think in that, I would strongly support that. We have all been deeply discouraged by the University of Aston. We've been shocked by the University of Aston decision to close its program, but nevertheless, it's precisely that kind of action that we do need to speak out about, because the humanities has an emphasis on critically interrogating historical and social circumstances, and can also, hopefully, provide new ways of thinking in the post-corona era, and possibly also point us to new ways of acting. The global pandemic will undoubtedly have consequences for the future, quite apart from the damage that it has inflicted on the physical and mental well-being of individuals, on world trade, on the economic health of nations, and on up-and-coming generations whose education has been damaged and whose employment prospects have been blighted. But I think what it has done is to call into question how we engage with the daily fabric of our societies, and forced us all in different ways to rethink how we communicate with one another. I was very struck by Charles Fosdick's presentation when he talks about the what he calls the microspection and on the minutiae of the everyday. The minutiae of the everyday is, of course, something that has, in a way, been forced upon all of us. But I think it's very significant that I hope that more and more people are starting to write about this kind of, I like the word microspection. I think I like it. And I want to conclude. I hope that we can have a discussion. As I said, I had no intention of producing a scholarly paper. I want to conclude by saying that one of the areas that I have been increasingly interested in, and particularly during the pandemic, doing these little armchair travels, I'm particularly interested in archaeology, in what we uncover of the past, the relationship that increasingly we start to see between monuments, tombs, things that can be uncovered, and the environment in which they were originally located. I'm sure Michael has visited the Carrow Moor megalithic cemetery just outside Sligo, which is an extraordinary place. But one of the most fascinating things about that prehistoric cemetery is the relationship with the mountains in the distance, because on the sight line is the the hills, the Ballygawley Hills, I think they are, and the Ballygawley Hills make the shape of a female body. And so in thinking about the relationship between what was built, and often built by builders who had remarkable skills, there is very clearly a direct link with the landscape. But how do we translate that? What do we know? There are so many monuments where we have no idea who the builders were. We've no idea what language they spoke. How do we go beyond translating what remains into our own terms? Do we, in archaeology, constantly use domestication as our translation strategy? We try to read ideas of rituals. We try to imagine, to project ourselves into another world. And this, I think, is absolutely fascinating for us, because we are faced with something that is, in one sense, untranslatable. That is a distant past. We can't, all we can do with it is to domesticate it, to reinterpret it. And yet, at the same time, the more we look at the evidence, the more the evidence defies or challenges our knowledge. And I think I've probably said enough. I'm going to stop there. I'm certainly going to, with my ideas of randomness, I'm now going to connect more and more randomness with archaeology. And I've just seen something come up on the chat saying that this is the subject of someone's thesis, which wonderful. There's someone who hopefully can give me some more tips and some more things that I could read in the future. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Susan. Certainly you've unleashed a very lively set of comments in the chat, and particularly when you were inviting people to smile. And I was struck. People were responding from smiling from all over the world. I was particularly struck by one comment from Paul Rollinson, who simply wrote "smiling Canadian," and I kind of misread that, I suppose. I presume Paul meant that he was a smiling Canadian, but I read it as meaning something like speaking French. And I was thinking, that set me thinking, well, smiling Canadian, perhaps Canadians smile in a different way. And I was thinking about the need, even when we do have the opportunity to see each other face to face and so on, nonetheless, there's a translation need so often when it comes to gestures and expression and so on. And one mustn't underestimate one mustn't overestimate how immediately comprehensible even the non-verbal languages of gesture and so on are. Yeah. Susan, that was such a rich set of thoughts about the pandemic and the effect of the pandemic on our attitudes, on our verbal responses in social media and so on, emotive language, and returning always to questions of translation, to Michael's work. Thank you so much. That's really opened up a whole new set of issues. There was some discussion in the chat around the question of Zoom and globalization, and about the extent to which Zoom is helping or not. I was thinking that Zoom has, of course, enabled conferences like this, which have opened up to audiences and also enabled us to bring speakers in. Yep. From around the world, and I think that was really coming out in your talk, the extent to which it so often cuts both ways.
It's not. Can I just come in there for a second? I've actually valued Zoom, Teams, whatever, enormously through this period. And I've also noticed something which I think it was last year that I first became aware of it, which is that having the chat definitely enables some people who might be a bit shy about asking a question in a room to participate. So yesterday, as I said, yesterday we had our annual postgraduate conference, and we were talking about, and one of the hopes expressed by several students was maybe when face-to-face contact resumes, we can also think about having, say, our postgraduate conference next year with a Zoom element. In other words, a hybrid element to do exactly what you're saying. I mean, when I look at this, what is so wonderful, there's people from all over the world participating in this, which probably wouldn't have happened if we'd stayed in Norwich, because not everybody would have got the funding. So this is, I think, another dimension. And maybe when I talk about how are things going to change, maybe they're going to change because we will move into more hybrid forms of
Yes.
a different kind of translanguaging, if you like, to use Michael's term.
Charles Forsdick has asked, Susan, would you talk about the links between translation and contagion, particularly in relation to the often unpredictable exponential proliferation they both imply?
Gosh, Charles, that's a tough question. Translation and contagion. Can you just clarify that slightly as to what you mean by translation and contagion? Can you type me something in? Because I'm not sure I understand the question. Which is, this is another problem of dealing with Zoom, that sometimes you end up not thinking as clearly as you might at one point. Has Charles clarified that? Where is it? Is he there?
They both have similar etymological roots and imply the similar spread of the phenomena for which they serve as vehicles. Thank you, Charles, for...
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Charles. And I think, actually, that I can't answer the question because I don't know, but what I am going to do is follow that up, because I hadn't really thought about contagion and randomness. And as I said, my particular interest is in the randomness of textual transfer and ideas. And, you know, one of the things I've been working on, and I think I've spoken about this, that some of you may have heard before, why certain texts and certain authors have huge success in target cultures and others fall by the wayside. What are some of these factors in this movement? But I think this idea of contagion is really interesting. So no, I can't talk about it because I really don't know enough, but I'm certainly going to follow it up. And thank you for that. I think that's a great idea.
I was at a conference on computer-assisted literary translation recently, so I was particularly interested in your the comments in your talk about machine translation, and that's been taken up to some extent in the chat as well. And you were wondering about the impact of machine translation on employment prospects, and I don't know whether or not, again, that might be it might cut both ways. And I'm struck by the as you say, the increasing importance of machine translation, particularly when we are so reliant on computers for our basic interactions like this. But kind of extrapolating, I suppose I'm still prepared to give the benefit of the doubt to those who would argue that there will simply be different roles for translators, perhaps retraining as editors, and the post-editing machine translation future, even if it extends for literary translators as well, might not be quite as scary as it's painted. But
I think this also has been triggered by, I referred to the University of Aston, the closing of the Translation, History and Languages program. And I think that rang such alarm bells, because I'd come across the Doris Bachmann-Meydick wrote to me and sent me a couple of pieces, and then she sent me the details of the pamphlet with her concerns. And I was thinking, one of the things that's going to happen as we move into the future is there are going to be all sorts of endeavors by managements of whatever, employers, universities, and so on, to save money. And therefore cutting. And I thought it's entirely possible that one could see a sort of group of university managers sitting around and saying, well, now Silke Luhrmann has just put something on the chat, which is really, really encouraging. So thank you, Silke, where she says increased automation was something she was really scared about when the pandemic started, but so far she's been busier than ever as a professional translator. Now that's good news. That's actually, I think, that is good news. Most of what I've been saying this afternoon comes from, let's say, the random thoughts of an elderly scholar in a house in the middle of the North Yorkshire moors, stuck for, at one point, weeks on end with no company but 2 dogs. Therefore, unable to get to libraries, unable to have anything other than endless Zooms. What happens is that one turns in on oneself, one rereads. That's why why on earth would I have reread Marshall McLuhan, someone that I thought was very exciting when I was a student. But I went back there. And I went back to David Damrosch wrote and told me about de Maistre. He said, do read this. So I read that. So I've been picking up things. And then I thought, prison diaries, shall I read prison diaries? And I thought, my God, no, I'm not going to read prison diaries. It's going to turn my life into a constant misery. But I did reread Le mie prigioni, which was a kind of classic when I was at school, and is actually quite a hopeful text about dealing with imprisonment. So these are, like I say, random thoughts that when you very kindly invited me to speak today, I thought, triggered by Michael's ideas, I would share some of these with an audience. Also, I should say that when you first invited me, this was going to be in person, wasn't it?
Indeed,
and
yes.
I've never passed up a chance to spend a day or two with Michael. We've had such fun over the years in so many places, and I'm only sorry that it's virtual now.
Indeed, yes, we were originally planning this event a year ago to be in person, and it was the plan was scuppered by the pandemic. We held off, hoping we'd be able still to meet in person, and then realized that we could be waiting quite a long time for that to work out. We have time perhaps for a last question here from Ye Tian. What I'm thinking is, during the pandemic, where people are overly relying on Zoom and internet, would it further marginalize those who already pretty much on the periphery are now living without internet connection?
Yeah.
Any hope that the translation under any possible definition might have a chance to address the issue?
I think that's an absolutely crucial point. I mean, I think one of it's very easy to be complacent and to say, oh, we've got, we're all online, we're all in, we're not. There are millions and millions of people who do not have internet access at all. And this is millions of people. I mean, there are actually millions of people in this country, millions of older people who have been completely disenfranchised by the move to make so much online. But yes, I think that is important. And I think quite how translation might be able to address the issue, I don't know. but I think it's a very, very important point to make, really important. And I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that that not everybody has the privilege, the immense privilege that we highly developed intellectual people have with internet connection. Could I make a quick plea, by the way, on this, which is to Fiona Kelso, who I don't know, but if she is doing a thesis on archaeology and translation, I would absolutely love to hear more about it. If she could email me, perhaps with some references or something, maybe we could share thoughts.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you once again for clearly a hugely stimulating set of reflections, which has set the chat abuzz, and I'm sure given us plenty to think about beyond our conference.